Okay, well, maybe I'll kick it off then. And thank you for having me. My name is Ari Blaff, and I am a reporter with the National Post. We covered this story in yesterday's paper, and we'll try to throw a link into the chat box for anyone who wants to follow along with some of the coverage of it. But I'm going to be speaking with Lisa Covens today, who is the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Communications at Leger, as well as Shanze, who's a Senior Research Director and who helped give me some feedback and perspective on the piece that I wrote and gave me some guidance on the really cool insights that came out of this recent study. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa to run through a little bit of the research and pick it up after that.
Great. Thank you so much, Ari. It was a pleasure working with you, and it was great to see the article come out yesterday. So welcome, everyone. Today, Shanze and I are going to share with you some insights into one of Canada's most vital assets, newcomers in our country. So understanding the journey, challenges, and preferences of newcomers is not just a matter of social interest, it's a strategic imperative for the government, for associations, and for businesses to align themselves in a diverse and evolving landscape. It's been a pleasure working with Shanze on this research, as she adds an important perspective as a newcomer herself, having immigrated 8 years ago into Canada as a graduate student. So I'll now hand it over to Shanze, who will take us through the context that led to us executing this research.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. So before we actually get into some of the highlights from this study, as Lisa mentioned, I'd like to share a little bit more about the context. So we recently completed the study among newcomers, but we need to understand what immigration trends really are, what the context of immigration really is, and why is it important to do this research. We're going to show you a better glimpse into who newcomers are, what their profile looks like, because I think right now we're at a juncture where everyone wants to learn more about newcomers, right? Everyone wants to do some research. Everyone wants to study who they are and what they bring to this country. But we haven't yet gone beyond seeing this group as a monolith. But it's really important to remember that there are lots of differences even within newcomers that separate them, that sort of separate their experiences. For example, someone like me who arrived here 8 years ago in a much better economic climate, who came here just as a student, is going to be very different from someone who came with their entire family in the midst of this economic crisis in the past 2 years. They're going to have a completely different settlement experience or view of this world. So we want to convey that idea that immigration is more than just numbers, and understanding this context, it's not just important, it's essential to appreciate the depth of the newcomer experience. So let's start with why immigration is important to Canada. The first reason that we're going to talk about, I think, is the one that we sort of talk about most when we think about immigration or immigrants coming into our country, and that's growth. Immigration is a key driver of Canada's population growth. As our birth rates remain low amidst an aging population, newcomers, they contribute to both population growth, but then in turn also economic growth or economic expansion. And so what ends up happening is we make sure that our workforce continues to grow and is healthy. But this growth should be seen as more than just economic, because what this leads to is the enrichment of our social fabric. And that's what brings us to our next point, which is innovation. So what we've seen in our studies and in some StatsCan research is that the challenges and experiences that newcomers face, they often lead them to innovative solutions as well. And this could be in the form of technology, this could be in the form of businesses, and it could be in the form of community development. And what we've actually seen is that business ownership rates are higher among immigrants than in the non-immigrant population. According to StatsCan, immigrants make up a third of business owners with paid staff in Canada. That's a pretty high proportion. So they're clearly a little bit more entrepreneurial than the non-immigrant population. We've also conducted research with the Entrepreneurship Foundation in Quebec, and what that shows is that there has been an increase in the rate of entrepreneurial intention among immigrants. And that intention rate is twice as high when you compare it to non-immigrants. So what we saw is the dissatisfaction with one's job is significantly more likely to lead to the intention to start a business among immigrants compared to non-immigrants. Similarly, we had more immigrant business owners who were unemployed before they started a business compared to non-immigrants. So what does that tell us? The data is basically indicating that when newcomers can't find a job, or that they can't find the job that they're satisfied with or is suitable for them, they will create their own. So they are actually responsible for creating local jobs across various sectors of our economy. Now for our third point, diversity. Now, we know that diversity is our strength, and in many ways, it's an essence of what it means to be Canadian. We have to remember, though, that each newcomer brings in a piece of their country of origin to Canada. Now, this could be their language, this could be their traditions, or this could be their unique perspectives. Recognizing the benefits of this diversity is what will allow us to build an inclusive community where each member of society, so each newcomer that we're bringing into this country, they can equally participate and contribute to society. Finally, we have opportunity. Now, of course, there's one way, which is that immigrants represent a sense of opportunity. They come to Canada because this group is because Canada is sort of seen as a land of opportunity, a place where their hard work can be rewarded, where they can integrate themselves into the Canadian way of life. But what we have to remember is that it isn't only an opportunity for immigrants. Of course, this is a mutual exchange, and it provides an opportunity for all Canadians to learn, to embrace new ideas, and to broaden our collective understanding. I want to quickly take you through a few of the numbers to better understand current immigration trends. So if we look at this historical data, what we see is a consistent upward trend in immigration. And by your latest census in 2021, immigrants made up 23% of the population. In less than 2 decades from now, or by 2041, this number is expected to actually go up to 34%. And what that means is 1 in 3 Canadians will be an immigrant. So this is a very important subgroup to study, to better understand. The Canadian government's immigration targets for 2024 to 2026 are very ambitious. So for 2024 itself, we have 485,000 immigrants coming into this country. For 2025, we have 500,000, and for 2026, we also have 500,000. But what's important to note here is the 60% that we have mentioned here, which is that 60% of this target is the economic class of immigrants. So these are people who have been selected for their skills and for their ability to contribute to our economy. So why do we need to keep that perspective in mind? If that is the reason that they have immigrated, if that is the driving motivation behind their journey, then if we are missing the mark, or if we're not delivering on that, and by we, I mean the country as a whole, or the economic climate as a whole, then it's obviously going to feed into how they feel settled, whether they feel that they are yet integrated into this country or not. So let's dive a little bit deeper into who newcomers are. What are their origins? What are their demographics? And what are the unique attributes that they bring into this country? What you see over here is the distribution of the immigrant population by region of birth. And what you can see is that it is evolving. The proportion of immigrants who have been arriving from Europe has been on the decline, while the proportion of immigrants who are arriving from Asia and the Middle East is rising. So this region makes up the majority of the immigrant population at the moment. And if you go specifically into the top 10 countries of origin, we have India, we have Philippines, China, Syria, Pakistan, the US, Iran, Nigeria, France, and then the UK. So a little less from Europe and a little more from other regions of the world. I want to give you a little bit of an understanding from a demographic standpoint, what the differences are between new Canadians and Canadians at large. What we see is that while the gender proportion of the general population is relatively balanced, there is a subtle but noteworthy female skew among newcomers. And that can be important in tailoring support and tailoring integration services for this demographic. When it comes to age, the differences between the two groups are much more pronounced, and what you really see is a reversal of trends. So the majority of newcomers are under the age of 55, as you see over here, and therefore they're significantly younger than the broader Canadian demographic. Although we won't get into it too much in this presentation, I do want to point out that these are just two of many demographic differences that they bring. So for example, in education and income, we see that new Canadians actually over-index on higher education. And that's just sort of a part of, their qualification criteria for being admitted into this country as well, their selection criteria. And so they are higher education. However, they're not getting commensurate income levels. And what that really means is there's a disconnect between their education and their income. So they actually have a median income that's lower than our general population. Why is it important to keep this disconnect in mind? The policies and the programs that we build will need to leverage this educational background of newcomers to facilitate their integration. So when we look to speak to them, when we look to resonate with new Canadians, it's an absolute necessity to understand this demographic distribution, because they're not just a unique group because of where they're coming from or the country that they are from. It's because they embody a distinct demographic profile that sets them apart. And it drives a lot of the variation that we're seeing between the two groups, between new Canadians and the general population. So we've been hearing a lot from our clients about the need for insights on newcomers, about including them in our studies, about delivering on how they can reach them, what they need to do to speak to them, to communicate with them, to tailor their products, their services, or their policies. Pinterest, for example, has stood out as a trailblazer in this area. We conducted a study with them last year, and Pinterest was able to gain valuable insights into new Canadians, how to engage with them effectively, and how to find their role in the settlement journey. How does Pinterest really fit in? Rogers Omni News also collaborated with us back in October. We conducted a study of immigrants, and we uncovered insights on how is the affordability crisis making the Canadian dream, so to speak, further and further out of reach. Now, these are just a couple of examples that our team personally has done. In addition to these, there are many other clients that are looking to us to add, a specific newcomer sample to their studies, or a boost group, so to speak. So as we seek to understand and support newcomers, it's essential to crack the code and understand their experiences, their challenges, and their aspirations in Canada. And that brings us to our recent study. So what was our methodology? We did a detailed, comprehensive survey of over 2,100 recent immigrants who have arrived in the past 10 years. So this gives you a really robust foundation for our insights. Our data was collected solely through our in-house LEO panel, and that allows us to target subpopulations such as this one. Data collection was completed by the end of Feb, and we weighted it to the 2021 census profile available for this group to ensure that it is in fact representative of new Canadians who have arrived in the past 10 years and representative of the profile that we were speaking about. I will take you through a few of the key highlights before I hand it back to Lisa to share some more. But first, we asked them, why did you immigrate to Canada? What were the reasons that you chose this country? What was the reason for your move? And the top reason is economic. It was fueled by economics, and 70% mentioned this. That includes 62% who were looking for a better standard of living. So that was netted within those economic reasons. The second reason is for educational opportunities. So we had 45% who said that they either came for educational opportunities for themselves or for their children. And that leaves about 2 in 10 who came for family reunification. What you will see is the numbers don't, of course, add up to 100. That's because there could be multiple reasons for immigrating to Canada. And so it was a multi-select question. The other thing that I want to mention is that economic reasons being the driving force of immigration, of course, makes a lot of sense when you especially put it in context with, 60% of immigrants coming under, the economic class. So if that is their status, or if that is how they entered this country, that is, of course, their first and foremost driving force, and what they're going to look at in terms of whether they feel settled or not. Which brings me to the timeline. So we wanted to highlight a few of the steps that newcomers take to integrate into Canadian society. And what are the first few steps? Honestly, it's the basic necessities. The basic necessities such as opening a bank account or signing up for a mobile plan. These are the fundamental first steps without which you really can't get to the next stage. We have renting a home come in a little bit later. So the distance sort of signifies that it takes a little bit more time, which of course makes sense. But what was interesting was that a quarter of new Canadians actually were able to rent their home before stepping foot in Canada. So this is something that they figured out before they entered the country. We then have securing a first job, which comes a little bit later. It takes more time. And we see that especially for those who have settled in the last 5 years. Among that group, securing a first job has taken even more time than those who arrived 6 to 10 years ago. Registering with a family doctor is quite a bit further along the timeline, but that's not really surprising. We also know that Canadians who have been here for many, many years, for their entire lives, also struggle with this. So it's an issue that affects both groups. Buying or leasing a car, we see this closer to the top as well, because we actually have 2 in 5 newcomers who have not yet done this. So 2 in 5 among those who came in the last 10 years who have not yet done this. If we narrow that down or isolate the group who arrived in the past 5 years, actually nearly half have not yet bought or leased a car. And then we have buying a home as the last step along this path. It's at the top of the hill. And the reason is that it is obviously taking the most amount of time. It is a sign of long-term commitment to the country. It symbolizes a sense of permanence. It's your milestone to help you solidify that you've made it in the country. And that's especially important when we think about the fact that newcomers quite heavily under-index on home ownership. So only 1/3 of newcomers own a home compared to 6 in 10 new Canadians. So this is one of your final or grand finale, I would say, in terms of your milestones. Now, I'm going to just shed a little bit of light on this question that we asked, which is, after arriving to Canada, how long did it take you to be fully financially self-sufficient? And we define that as being able to cover all of your living expenses without any financial assistance from external sources. So on average, newcomers say it takes nearly 20 months to become fully financially self-sufficient, and that's when they can cover all of their living expenses, housing, food, healthcare, transportation, all of that. But what's important to note is that this 19.6 months is only among those who feel that they are at this moment financially self-sufficient. That leaves 1/3 of your newcomers who say they are not yet financially self-sufficient. And it's even higher among those who arrived in the last 5 years. So it goes up to 45%. So this is quite a big number who's not yet there. I'm going to now hand it over to Lisa, because we've gone through, their profile, these trends, financial self-sufficiency, but we haven't yet heard about those emotions, about how they're feeling at the moment, and whether they really feel like Canada is home. So I will hand it over to her to take over.
Thank you, Shanze. That was a great introduction and context setting for the rest of this presentation. Great job on that. So newcomers often seek the Canadian dream, which according to the earlier Leger-Rogers Omni News poll that Shanze mentioned, this means things such as a stable and good life, personal freedom, career opportunities. So are we delivering? I would say yes, from the results we have. Our study found as many as 74% feel well integrated into Canadian society, and 60% consider themselves Canadian. Now, the balance of that agree scale is a bit more heavily weighted on the just agree and not strongly agree, but we're getting there. Still, the majority for both feel that they agree with those statements. So our results also affirm Canada's reputation and strong standing as a welcoming destination for immigrants. In fact, 82% of newcomers feel welcome in Canada. But further to that, our data is consistently debunking the myth that Quebec is less welcoming because the sense of belonging extends uniformly across the different provinces in our country. But what I do want to note is that this question reveals some variations in experiences among the ethnic groups, with individuals from Middle Eastern and North African, Chinese, or South Asian backgrounds reporting a relatively lower sense of belonging. So for governments, associations, and companies across Canada, the best advice we can give you is to better understand the ethnic reality of newcomers. So having someone from the community is your best investment. And tomorrow, Ian and Shanze are going to dig in deeper in the financial sector, and this is going to become a bigger topic as that story unfolds. But why don't the 15% of newcomers feel welcome? So we looked at all of the different things that could play into that, and lower quality of life, those who don't agree that Canada feels like home, those who have not received sufficient support, and those who do not feel like the cost of living aligns with what their expectations were are more likely to say that they don't feel welcome in Canada. Right, so as we've seen on previous slides, Canadians seem to be welcoming to newcomers, making them feel well integrated. However, the government appears to be falling a little short. Newcomers do not overwhelmingly agree that they receive sufficient support, resources, and guidance from the Canadian government to help them settle in. So as you can see there, only 52% agree that they had that adequate support from the government. And even within that, very small amount strongly agreed with that statement. And similarly, well, on the flip side, 43% disagreed. So not surprisingly, those who say their quality of life here is worse than in the country of origin are more likely to disagree with this statement. So they're more likely to feel like they didn't get those resources when they settled in Canada from the government. All right, so there's a significant gap between what newcomers expected the cost of living in Canada to be and the reality they encounter. So if you read Ari's article yesterday, this was the headline, that 84% find Canada to be more expensive than anticipated. That's a big number. So this discrepancy between expectations and reality suggests that being unprepared for the high costs can make that adjustment even more challenging. Keep in mind, 7 in 10 came to Canada for economic reasons, including that better standard of living. So that disconnect can really be jarring. So while as many as 6 in 10 say they could cover an unexpected expense of $500 from their household's resources, this does leave 40% either unable or unsure if they could weather this situation. So this is a standard question that StatsCan asks, and the stat among all Canadians is 26% of Canadians could not cover such an expense. So 26% compared to 40%. That's a big difference that we're seeing between newcomers and Canadians overall. All right, so broader societal challenges that all Canadians are facing, like the rising cost of living, economic hurdles, and housing issues, might disproportionately impact those new members of our community as they settle into Canada. So when looking at the most important issues for newcomers, the top 4 were rising costs and inflation, jobs in the economy, affording a place to live, and the state of our healthcare system. For Canadians overall, the top 4 are the same, but they're in a slightly different order and a slightly different weight. So we have rising costs and inflation, similarly as the number 1 most important issue, but a little heavily more weighted. Second for Canadians overall is the state of healthcare, followed by affording a place to live, and then jobs in the economy. So there's quite a difference between how important jobs in the economy is for newcomers versus Canadians overall. So turning back to data we collected on behalf of the Canadian press in November of 2023. So this research was collected among all Canadians. We see the issue doesn't seem to lie with immigration policy directly. Neither Canadians nor newcomers seem to think that's the root problem. The concern is around adding a strain on those existing infrastructures, such as housing or the healthcare system. 76% of Canadians recognize that immigration greatly enriches the country's cultural diversity, which is something Shanze mentioned at the beginning. However, the same proportion links an increase in immigrants to exacerbating the housing crisis and straining the healthcare system at 3/4 for each of those. Therefore, Canadians see the positive aspects of immigration, but are apprehensive about the impact to the current infrastructure. So a core aim, as Shanze mentioned at the beginning as well, for Canada's immigration strategy is to bolster the labor force, and therefore we draw on immigrants in search of economic opportunity. However, many newcomers encounter significant barriers in the job market. Addressing these issues requires an effort to reduce these barriers in the job market and smooth the path to job market integration for immigrants through credential recognition and offering programs that can help align with their skill set with market needs. So 60% of immigrants are welcome to Canada under that economic class umbrella, which includes the skilled trades. Yet there are challenges in actualizing this need, with 60% of employed newcomers saying they had difficulty with credentials and local experience when looking for a job. 59% of employed newcomers say that they got a job in their field, while 38% say they were not able to. So securing a job in their field was higher among those who came to Canada 6 to 10 years ago under a slightly different economic circumstances versus those who've come in the past 5 years. So we're seeing some differences there. And as Shanze referred to our study, another study we did, when immigrants can't find a job in their field, they are more likely to create one and build a business. So, all right, there's a notable difference in opinions between newcomers and Canadians overall regarding cultural integration. Half of newcomers believe the best approach is to encourage them to preserve and promote their cultural and religious identities in Canada. This contrasts with only 26% of Canadians overall who share this view. It's a big difference there. So instead, most Canadians believe newcomers should adapt by leaving behind aspects of their cultural identity that might clash with mainstream values. This is a stance that only 34% of newcomers agree with. And this reveals a clear mismatch between immigrants' expectations and the prevailing attitudes of the existing population. So while there are clearly differing views on this topic, again, 85% of newcomers feel comfortable participating in cultural and religious practices in Canada. That's great. They're not seeing those different views come to life. And as previously mentioned, 82% of newcomers say they do feel welcome in Canada. So even though the views are different, it really isn't shining through to newcomers. We asked newcomers the same questions we've asked Canadians previously, and that is a common statement about Canada is that diversity is our strength. And again, we see some differing views on this. While about half of both groups say that some elements of diversity can provide strength, but some elements of diversity can cause problems or conflict. Newcomers were way more likely than Canadians to say that diversity is definitely a strength for Canada. And that was 42%, versus only 24% of Canadians overall sharing that view. Instead, the general population was 3 times as likely to say that diversity is often causing problems or conflict in Canada. So our research overall opens doors for policy improvement, greater public engagement. It's important for our public discussions to emphasize the diverse benefits immigrants provide, from cultural contributions to our demographic sustainability moving forward, as well as their clear economic impact. This approach can foster a more informed and balanced conversation about the importance of immigration in our society. So 3 in 10 newcomers say their quality of life is either the same or worse than in their country of origin. But when we ask them that $1 million question, if you had to make the decision all over again, would you choose to immigrate to Canada? 2/3 of newcomers say yes. So regardless of the challenges they face, the key drivers of whether newcomers would do it all over again are whether they feel welcome, whether they feel well integrated, whether they feel that Canada is their home, and if they feel that they've received sufficient support from the government. So in other words, Canada must deliver on all of these criteria to make future plans for immigration successful for all. Because even if newcomers are facing challenges in other areas of their life, if these boxes are checked, they would be willing to do it all over again. And when we were discussing these findings over the last week, I posed this million-dollar question to Shanze and kind of put her on the spot, to be honest. And I honestly didn't know what her answer would be. I know what I was hoping it would be. Without even hesitation at all, she answered a resounding yes. She would do it all over again. But then she quickly backtracked and said, I came 8 years ago and it was a different economic time. So maybe it's not the same as we saw in our results. The 0 to 5 year newly immigrated to Canada have, they're still getting there. They're still working their way along that path. But obviously, as you can see today, Shanze is well established in Canada and is doing a great job at Leger. So we're happy to have her, and so happy to hear she has no plans of leaving anytime soon. So if you're looking for more insights, we are selling more insights to this study. So there's tons of data, tons of different questions we didn't mention, crossed by a lot of different demographic analysis that is available to purchase. And if you'd like to reach out to any of us or to solutions@leger360.com, we're happy to help you. But a few final points on that. So again, if you want to purchase the study, reach out. And number two, I can't say enough about the strength of our LEO panel for this particular study, but for really all of the work that we do, specifically when we're trying to target subsets of the population, such as newcomers. So the 2,100 plus completes came from our LEO panel of engaged respondents, and made it very easy for us to really rely on these findings and know that they are accurate to the population of newcomers in Canada. Lastly, had we wanted to target specific ethnicities or regions or any other precise subgroup, we would have engaged our partners at Leger Digital, their team, to employ their hard-to-reach solution, which uses precision-targeted social media campaigns to get to the group you're looking for. So I had a request recently for a specific ethnic group in the GTA, and that's all doable using Leger Digital, as using their hard-to-reach methodology. So the other report topics that we have, and that we will be selling as part of the full report, are challenges in support, the settlement experience in more detail, multiculturalism, personal finances, and you'll hear more about personal finances and the banking and insurance preferences tomorrow when Ian and Shanze detail that. Tomorrow, same time, same place at noon, as well as some demographic analysis by question. So now we will open it up to any questions you may have. So I think I'll hand it over to Ari, who is going to go through some of these questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really enjoyable to hear firsthand from you guys again. And it's something which came up recently during a coffee chat with a good friend of mine from graduate school who came to Canada about 5-6 years ago and from India, and has also been struggling with a lot of the similar things which a lot of normal Canadians, especially people who live in big cities, are struggling with in terms of affordability, healthcare, all that kind of stuff, rent. And so I was curious if you can maybe walk us through some of the things that could have surprised you with this research. I know there was a lot of commonality, and maybe that was one of the points that could have surprised you. But I'm curious if you guys could talk a bit more at length about if there was anything that after you went through it all and looked at really all the research, something that stood out to you as like, oh, I didn't expect that going into this.
Hi, Shanze, did you want to take that one or do you want me to?
Sure, I can take it. I think one of the things that surprised me the most was how, I guess, unprepared immigrants feel in terms of the level of how expensive it really is. And of course, that differs in terms of the region that they end up immigrating to. We also know, of course, that newcomers end up settling in more urban areas in sort of the downtown core, which of course is also more expensive. But the fact that there's such a huge proportion, 8 in 10, who found it more expensive than they thought it would be, it explains a lot of that those feelings that we're hearing about, that it's not what they expected, that some are even looking to go back. I think if there was a better sort of understanding of I guess the pressures that the whole country is facing, I think it would a little bit help in their integration as well. But yeah, I didn't expect that number to be quite as high as it was.
Okay, and maybe I will piggyback off of that question to grab one of the Q&A questions from Jennifer, who asked regarding the question about the level of agreement with the statement that they received the right level of support from the Canadian government. What are the demographics associated with the newcomers who indicated they did not agree with the statement? Do adequate financial resources or solid relationships within the community factor at all in how supported newcomers feel by the Canadian government? So did you guys end up doing a bit more drilling down into some of the research of which communities feel a bit more supported, have a bit more social networks throughout the country to be able to help them transition into Canada?
Yeah, so some of that information is going to be available in the full report, especially by the different ethnicities and countries of origin. So we don't have that right off the top of this webinar. In terms of whether or not they had solid relationships with the community, we didn't ask a specific question about that, although we kind of get at that in terms of some different questions, but we can follow up, Jennifer, after the webinar with some more information on that.
And there was another cool question which I came across in the Q&A from Debbie, who asked about long wait lists when it comes to English classes. And she was asking, were there any questions related to the impact of low or no English language skills for new arrivals, and maybe if that would have impacted the immigrant experience?
Yeah, what I will say is that as a part of requirements of immigrating to Canada, proficiency in an official language usually makes it into those requirements. So because of that, everyone who does enter, they do have a pretty solid sense of proficiency when it comes to both English or French, depending on if you settled in Quebec or if you settled elsewhere. So it's something that when we did ask this question, even within our study, and we see that as would be expected, there is a pretty high level of proficiency for at least one of the two official languages. Of course, they also bring with them a host of other mother tongues as well. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about a working level and solid proficiency in the language, which definitely does seem to exist. But again, it's just part of how they enter into Canada, because it's not, we're not just thinking about refugees, which is a much smaller proportion of the immigrants that come in. The highest level is, of course, the economic class. So that would explain that.
Another great question from Christopher, which I wish I had asked you originally when I wrote that article. But he said, looking forward at some of the trends, what's keeping you awake at night? Are there certain headwinds or tailwinds when you look at this in terms of possibly housing, affordability, stress on infrastructure, healthcare, where it looks like there's going to be a real crossroads where Canadians are going to have to either make massive investments or change their outlook on immigration? I'm curious, if any of that is a wake-up call or a cause for concern.
I think we're seeing those stresses across the board for Canadians and newcomers. And I think just from looking at the results, I think, yeah, our country, our government, our businesses, we need to be better at those things and get better at housing affordability and infrastructure, healthcare, all those things for Canadians overall, but also for given the level of immigration, because you don't want to create a scenario where that, people are, unhappy with the level of immigration because of the stress on these systems. So because people are feeling the stresses themselves. We saw in terms of the most important issues for Canadians, healthcare, rising cost, affordable housing. The only one that was a bit mismatched on that was jobs in the economy. And we know the stresses of jobs on newcomers to Canada tend to be specific to the situation, the credential recognition and local experience. So that isn't something that's felt as much with Canadians overall. But yeah, Canadians overall, as well as newcomers, are feeling the stress on affordability and housing and health.
Can I add to that just a little bit, actually? So one of the things that we realized, though, again and again, as we went through this research, is that clearly the issue is with those stressors, the stress that's being felt on the infrastructure. It's not that people don't want immigrants in the country. It's not that people don't value everything that they bring in. That question sort of gets exactly to the root of it, which is that everyone is worried about the strain that it is putting on the existing system that we have in place. So without improving that, without fixing the things that everyone has been talking about, a better match between skills in the current market, getting that credential recognition that Lisa is talking about, without that, it's really hard to move forward. And if everyone is feeling it, of course, newcomers who have just arrived are going to disproportionately feel all of those things. So until we sort of find our balance and figure out how we're going to move forward from here, how we're going to solve these problems for Canadians, but then also for new Canadians, it's for sure something that keeps me up personally.
Well, and even the family doctor piece, like when we were looking at the results and we saw that in the timeline, I was thinking, wow, I know so many people that don't have a family doctor, and your family doctor retires, and then it's really tough to find another one, or you moved, you never had one to begin with. So this is felt on for everyone here. So I was actually happy to see, the percentage of newcomers that do have a family doctor, although not 100%, so still not perfect, but yeah, things like that where it's not unique and to anyone. It's just felt a little more strongly with newcomers.
Is the strain amongst the general population more pronounced in provinces where you are more of a magnet community, like let's say BC and Ontario, as opposed to maybe PEI or some of the territories? Like, does that show up in the data as well? Like, provinces or territories that don't have as much relative high levels of migration are not feeling the same level of tension around that?
We do have some regional differences. Like it depends on what metric you look at. But it's an interesting question, because of course, for the same reasons you see, the pressure is much higher in Ontario, for example. But then the problem is, it's when you look directly into Toronto, or when you look directly at Vancouver. So that's where it's going to be felt the most. So sometimes those regional differences don't come up when you look at the overall province, but if you drill down deep into the city, where you probably would see this. We will be shedding light on that in our actual final report, though. But yes, that's exactly what we have been seeing through a lot of our research. Even for the stuff that we conducted for Rogers as well, and what they published.
Can you explain a little bit more about some of the Quebec findings? It sounds like Quebec was something which initially we would have expected to see maybe lower levels of approval and maybe a bit more hesitancy. And it seems as though they sort of fell in line with the rest of the provinces and the rest of the nation in terms of their support for a lot of this.
Yeah, I think, it's a sort of a long held belief that Quebecers are less welcoming to newcomers. And I know we were happy to see that, and we've started to see this in other research as well, that's just not true anymore. So they just need to shake that from their reputation, which, as we know, Shanze and I will be talking reputation in a few weeks. It's tough to recover from a bad reputation. So it's they've definitely not living up to that reputation they once had, and we're seeing that the results are pretty even keel across the board on those metrics.
I actually So when I initially came to the country, I was in Montreal. That's where I studied, and I had a great experience overall. But again, there's multiple things that are driving that difference, or rather that uniformity in Quebec versus the rest of Canada. I think one, we've seen in a lot of our studies that when you ask these questions, such as, you know, how they feel about the cost of living crisis or the economic crisis, it's actually felt a little bit less in Quebec than it is in the rest of Canada. And because of that, if the economic strain is less, I would assume that that's also why that settlement experience, or why people are feeling more welcome in that country. They don't feel as, I guess, their reality is not as off from their expectations as it is in the rest of the country. So I think that's a part of it. Then, of course, people who are settling into Quebec, they know French. They're required to know French as a part of their qualification criteria. So that also helps. And yeah, and then of course there's the last bit, which is that they settle into the major cities like in Montreal, and of course that's going to be an even better experience just in terms of being in a multicultural hub in Quebec. So yeah, we're definitely seeing, we saw that in our Pinterest results, we saw that in our Rogers results, and we're seeing that here. We don't see that myth hold up.
Is there advice or good policy solutions that you think provincial governments, federal governments should be looking at? There was a recent Leisure poll where it talked about there's some growing dissatisfaction amongst immigration levels. I think, as it shows in the surveys, more to do with infrastructure stress and affordability. But what are things that, or policy options that federal governments or provincial governments should be looking at or investigating, maybe as a potential way to find a common path for both communities?
It goes two ways for me. Like, I think like one direction is the credential mismatch that we were talking about. That's number one in my head. I think it would, you know, soften or like fill that gap that we're seeing between education and income right now. I mean, think about it from imagine you were in their shoes, is what I'm trying to say. And if you do feel that you have really high education levels and you're not seeing any job that's like right for you, you have a medical background and you have to end up doing something that has really nothing to do with your field, I just can't imagine that is going to be, you know, you're not going to feel like this is your home until you feel more settled in that gigantic area of your life, which is your career, which is something you've worked for your entire life. So that is something that credential recognition, I think, that needs to be at the forefront. But then on the other side, I think what I see is we need to talk a little bit more about what the benefits are of this immigration, right? So I feel like there isn't enough discourse right now, and I guess that's just my opinion, on the value of immigrants. Right now, there's a lot of things we're talking about the strain that they're putting on the economy, but we're not talking about how they are actually also contributing to our growing economy, and they are in fact the driving force of our labor force, of you know, our growth. So I think we need to balance that narrative and public engagement, and make sure that all voices are sort of heard and understood in terms of this mutual exchange. Like, it's not just one side benefiting, we're all a part of this, that are hopefully going to benefit from this now and then also in the future.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't see a lot of the upside of immigration being really talked about in terms of that demographic sustainability. And like the flip side is, if we didn't have this level of immigration, what would happen to some key businesses and infrastructure that needs to run, and some jobs that need to be filled, clear skills that we need from people from other countries to come here, and because our population just isn't growing at the rate that we can keep up. So, but I don't know that you don't hear that a lot in society talked about.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I'm curious also, I was very fascinated by when you broke down how new arrivals feel when it comes to how welcome they are, but also by the ethnicity piece, which I felt was very fascinating. Like, for instance, Filipinos were comfortably the most agreeable in terms of feeling welcome. and even Black immigrants to America, Black immigrants to Canada felt a bit more welcome than white immigrants, which maybe would be, I don't know if there's any more drilling down on that, or just in general with some of the other communities. I was a little bit surprised that some, like Chinese, for instance, were probably on the lower end in terms of feeling welcome. And I wonder if there was any more drilling down that you guys did in terms of understanding why certain communities maybe would have felt a certain way, or if it might be impacted by their education levels, or if they have family members existing in the country. I'm just curious to throw it back to you guys on that.
Yeah, and it could also depend on where they tend to come to, like if it's Toronto or Vancouver. Shanze mentioned Montreal, Quebec is, the cost of living is a little bit different. They're not feeling the housing crisis as much as we might be in Toronto or Vancouver, and therefore there's some sort of other things at play there. Shanze, do you have any other insight into why that might be different?
We're for sure, I mean, that was for sure a very notable finding. Like the three groups stood out as feeling less welcome, and that was, I believe, South Asian, Chinese, and then Middle Asia and the Middle East, right?
Yes.
North Africa, I think.
Yeah, North Africa
Sorry.
and Middle East. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. So yeah, those are the three that stood out as feeling a little bit less welcome. And what we're going to do in our report is also see how these three groups feel on other different questions. So the way that we try to look at what might be driving this is by crossing those ethnicities against all the other questions and see, is there anything else, any other sentiment that they're over-indexing on or under-indexing on compared to the rest of the ethnicities we studied that would help explain why it is this way. To Lisa's point, yes, it could be related to region or demographics as well. But I do want to point out, it's not the first time that this exact trend has come up in, so this isn't the only study where we have seen those exact three ethnicities under index on feelings of integration and so on. So we're for sure going to look further into that and see what exactly it is that's driving that sentiment. But it's a great question.
Not to always be focused on the US, but I'm not sure, like, comparative level, how would the welcoming of Canadians compared to Americans? Like, how do the American immigrant experience is probably quite different, but is it a similar level of receptiveness, or is Canada uniquely warm and kind when it comes to new arrivals in that way?
I mean, we have that reputation, which we're trying to hang on to. I don't know if we have any research that would suggest one or the other being better than.
Yeah, but you have given us a pretty good angle. So this isn't going to be the last probably that you see of this study. So you have given us a pretty good angle to think about for the future to see if there is that comparison point. I mean, I can make a guess, but it's not going to be based on data, so I'm going to refrain. Yeah, maybe there is some study. We have Leisure US as well. So we'll look into see if they actually have some metrics that we can use to compare, because that would be a pretty interesting point, and see if our reputation can be upheld.
Very cool.
Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say I'd be curious to see what their answer to the question about it being more expensive than they anticipated. That would be kind of cool.
Well, thank you so much. I'm curious, maybe just as a parting question, I'm not sure if we have to wrap up shortly, but if there was one takeaway that you both feel is very important that maybe policymakers, legislators, journalists should even focus on and do some more research into, is there something that really stood out as there's a big question mark on this one? I'd like to learn more about it.
Maybe not learn more about, but I think that for me, the thing that I want everyone to take away is that 2/3 would do it all over again. And I think that, it's easy to get focused on the negatives. It's easy. They just stand out more, right? And there's a lot more to talk about when we're thinking about everything that might be wrong. But there is 2/3 of newcomers who would do this all over again, despite everything, despite all the challenges we're talking about, despite all that mismatch. Just, it's clearly we're doing something right as well. So we need to focus, we need to remember that, we need to balance this narrative, we need to balance this conversation. We of course need to talk about all the struggles and all the challenges that newcomers and also Canadians are facing because of this. But we can't forget everything it's bringing, and clearly overall the sentiment is happy. It's good, and they do it again. They feel welcome. They feel integrated. So if you would take something away, I would say it's that it's not all bad, and I would say it's overwhelmingly positive. Just
Lisa, any thoughts or any major takeaways that you'd like to highlight or you think worth keeping an eye on in the coming 6 months or a year?
Yeah, I mean, same thing. I was really happy to see that 2/3 and to know that it's like it really is driven by how they felt when they came here and if they felt welcome and integrated, and not based on those other not as clearly based on those other touch points of finding a job or being financially well established. It's really like how are they treated in Canada? Did they feel welcome? And the other thing that really stood out to me was those opposing views on diversity and the opposing views on whether or not how they should handle cultural or religious practices. And while the views are quite different from Canadians and newcomers don't feel that. So it's not being projected on them, which is really great, that they still feel open to practicing cultural and religious practices. They still feel welcome. So even though there's the difference in view, it's not influencing how they feel practicing their culture and their religion, which is great, which I think is so Canadian that while it's the difference in views is like doesn't look great on Canadians overall, and in my opinion, but the fact that it's not felt is probably a very Canadian polite society view, which does make me happy to see.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me over here to be able to speak with you guys and learn so much about it. And it was really fascinating to be able to write the article and learn more about some of the interesting developments within the newcomer community and how the general population is receiving that. But it's a really great partnership, and National Post is very happy to be here and to learn more along the way.
Yeah, and thank you for being our partner on that, and we really appreciate it. And as these things go with tech, we kind of lost Shanze. Now she's back just in time to say goodbye. I was just saying how tech issues, if they're going to happen at the final hour while we're saying goodbye, is probably not the worst timing. But now you're back. So yeah, it was great partnership all around, and we appreciate everyone who attended the webinar. And if you had questions that were not answered, we will get back to you. And please, again, tune in tomorrow to see the results of the newcomer piece by financial and insurance questions, which will be really interesting as well. So Shanze will be back, and we will have Ian Large from our Toronto team as well going through the results. So, thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.